Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jensen, and we're back with Module 2, Crime, Criminality, and the Media Part 4, where we're going to talk about copycat crime. So this is probably the only class in the entire major that really puts particular attention into this phenomena, so some of you probably are kind of excited about it. This might bring back memories or ideas about things like Breaking Bad. So in TV, Breaking Bad has been said to inspire crimes because the series depicts a high school chemistry teacher who has cancer and begins making and selling drugs to obtain money for his medical treatment. And there were a couple crimes that said they're basically re-implementing Breaking Bad. There are some films like Scream or Fight Club, Saw, and The Dark Knight. Look for mass shootings or murders and so forth. Those are some of our non-fictional examples. There are a few fictional ones like Friday the 13th Part 5, Detention, and Hotline Miami 2, Wrong Number. As far as criminals that have historically been identified as copycats, you have Jack the Ripper, the Zodiac Killer in the 60s in San Francisco, the Chicago Tylenol murders, where people had taken Tylenol over the counter after it was laced with cyanide. Richard Ramirez is another one, and the Dunblane Massacre. So those are a few that come to mind, and if you're interested, I can point you in the direction to find out about more of those. But that's kind of the stuff we're getting into here. So copycat crimes are really crimes inspired by an earlier media publicized or generator crime that someone has seen before, but most of the time it's media. The imitator incorporates major elements of the original crime into their offense, and this might be type of victim, it might be modus operandi, or the method by which they commit the crime, motivation they use to pull it off, or maybe the scene they want to set up. There are some error problems. Sometimes that when we try to identify copycats, we actually impute the inspiration of the criminal to similar or known crimes when they really just might be coincidences. But again, we define and then we see, and sometimes we see what we want to define and our own bias gets in the way. Or at other times we fail to discover similarities or uncover how the second offender was inspired by the first, and so it might not be completely obvious to us. So this is a highly subjective way to look at crime, and we have to be very mindful of that as we go forward. So first, know that copycat crime is atypical. It's low frequency, and it represents very tiny amounts of crime, almost none. Similarities might be dramatic, but there are often really more mundane features that are kind of idiosyncratic. Trying to find patterns across these behaviors where many features are not shared invites overinterpretation, and again, we go back to that social constructionism and inaccuracies that come from that. So again, we make associations that aren't true or accurate, and we're using judgments to come to conclusions rather than facts. It's very, very hard to predict precisely, and when we study copycat crime, it's studied via an examination of what we call imitation and modeling. So first, modeling, where you're really just using some previously perpetuated crime as a model. It's been around a while, but copycat crime has been an explanation dating back to Tard in the 1800s. More recently, the term was first coined around 1916 due to the crimes that were inspired by Jack the Ripper, or at least potentially inspired. We can't conclusively say that. Two ways in which we learn through modeling are things like vicarious reinforcement. So we see rewards and punishments of others with cues to maximize the rewards, and the same goes for criminal behavior. We see how people get away with things, and we try to import those same techniques into what we're doing. You also have cognitive organization, where we just put together information from our observations to figure things out. So, it's a little bit part observation, but part vicarious reinforcement, but not through ourselves. Then you have the other side of this, which is imitation. So imitation suffers from the problem of what we call an embarrassment of riches, trying to do too much. And imitation predicts really too much copycat crime, and the logical question becomes, is this an overextension of itself? We really are all exposed to media crime coverage, but almost none of us are copycat criminals. So why is that? And that's also a classic question that Travis Hershey asks, saying, we don't ask the question, why do people commit crime? We should also be thinking about why aren't people committing crime, because it can reveal just as much. What keeps us following the law and the rules and being pro-social and not doing it. And again, exposure doesn't actually equal the behavior. It's not like it's this direct thing. So there is exclusive focus on imitation, which downplays the other factors involved, like personality and social conditions, and of course the context. So just modeling and imitation still kind of leave us lacking. There are other explanations of copycats. So one is called priming, and priming involves portrayals where we activate a cluster of associated ideas within our brain and within that potential copycat, and that actually increases the likelihood that he or she will behave similarly. So it's that you're kind of priming the pump, but those fundamental ideas and thoughts were already there, and it kind of pushes you into a tipping point. The other explanation is something we call scripts, where these are pre-established behavioral directions available for use, maybe from our favorite lines of crime TV shows or movies. But note that learning processes, including modeling and imitation, can be a source of the ideas that are primed and the scripts that are used. So these are a little bit more, I think, accurate and provide broader coverage because they also allow for other things to play a role. So some of the criticisms, though, are that these ideas really do not specify the mechanism for activation of the ideas. So if we're going to go with the clustering of ideas like priming, okay, what cluster of ideas matters? How many and how much do you need to have for you to get to that tipping point? And then if we go with scripting, which scripts are actually important versus ones that we might ignore? And what are the conditions that apply to get a copycat action out of it? So we're actually going to jump into your Surrett text for a minute to bring forward some important ideas for the module. So Surrett examines how an individual comes to commit the copycat crime, and he uses this idea called pathways. It starts with the media-covered generator crime. And then he identifies 3 paths for specifying how it can affect the individual copycat. The first path is systematic central processing. The second one is heuristic peripheral processing, and the third is narrative persuasion. So this is the time of the lecture where you want to get out that Surrett text and turn to a certain page. I have the slide that has the page as well. But the first thing we're going to look at is figure 4.1 in chapter 4 on page 88. So you might want to make a note of this in your textbook. The figure looks like this. So it has all these little boxes, and this is the pathways model, kind of showing all the different ways things can happen. And it kind of follows a yes-no example of, is this present? Then go to this step. If this is not present, then we go to this step. Okay, so we're going to kind of summarize these pathways, but you might want to use the diagram to review and follow, especially when we have assignments and quizzes over this material. So first, the systematic or central processing pathway. It operates with information obtained from media coverage of the generator crime, or the primary crime to be copied, to think instrumentally about how it can be used to plan and put into action the copycat crime that is instrumental, so like a robbery or hijacking. So this is actually very consistent with the cognitive organization dimension of imitation and modeling to accomplish things like just kind of getting ideas of how to pull something off, like using a map to get somewhere. The second pathway is the heuristic or peripheral processing pathway. So this one operates because media coverage of the generator crime prompts a spontaneous emotional response. So this one is more fracked with emotion. So the information is not instrumentally processed where we're organizing and planning, but it's emotionally felt. So this would lead to very impulsive and emotive copycat crimes like an assault or a hate crime. So these are the more kind of crimes of passion or on-the-spot crimes that occur. But we're gathering and getting ideas from that previous media coverage. So note, instead of being Cathartic, which we talked about last time, where it's kind of a release for you if you're struggling with things. This generator crime coverage actually triggers your emotional reaction, and you start to act spontaneously. And also note that a cognitive learning theory posits that those emotions are paired with cues through imitation and operant learning processes. And so we're going to be reinforced to things that are working for us or things that don't work for us, or at least our perception of it working. So it's going to kind of follow that path as well. The final path is narrative persuasion. And this operates through the narratives, things like stories or different, which are different from the previous usage of the term, provided especially in entertainment media, and now we have infotainment. It invites audiences to suspend belief and critical evaluation, so we're easily persuaded by the story. We can model the characters, the values, the attitudes, and the behavior. So this is where we are just absolutely compelled and overwhelmed and saturated by the story. So again, you're going to have some imitation and modeling in the pathway because it's just all-encompassing. We're completely engulfed in that story. And that story content is really transported to the person, or the person engages with the story. They want to live it out personally, and they have empathy for what's presented and really identify with it. They often will say, this is my life playing out in front of me, or I identify with this character because I've gone through that too. So it's kind of an empathetic mode. Finally, these pathways, we have some critiques about them as we've studied things. All three pathways will use priming and script activation to put that copycat crime into action. But note that the figure only posits rewards and punishments after the commission of a copycat crime, and it really doesn't do justice to the origination of the copycat crime. It says, okay, stories are powerful, so are emotions, and so are ideas and plans, but we're all exposed to emotions and stories and ideas and plans, and we're not becoming copycat criminals, so it's still not completely persuasive. Also, the rewards and punishments could be part of the vicarious modeling and imitation going on before and from the media coverage of the generator crime in each of these pathways. So the time order of things get a little messy with knowing what happens first or what happens next. There's a final area that we want to talk about, which is called the aggregate model that Surratt discusses. And he says, if we're not going to go case by case and, looking at Jack the Ripper or the Chicago Tylenol murders, then we can look at it as a group level phenomenon. So the amount of copycat crime in the aggregate, or its rate, results from the interaction of four factors. So of course we look at the generator crime and the criminal. We look at the media coverage of the generator crime, the social context in which it occurs, and then the characteristics of the copycat. And we put all these things together in aggregate to try to be predictive. It has varying success. But again, remember, copycats are very rare. So we're going to jump into the Surratt text again and go turn the page to figure 4.2. And this is where we see that aggregate copycat crime model. And he has kind of phase A, phase B. So let's kind of work our way through this. So here we have characteristics of the criminal, of the generator, and then these arrows start to indicate action where we deem entertainment value or newsworthiness of it, or determine whether the crime was successful or a failure and what innovative elements are there. Of course, the media coverage and social media attention happens. And then we look at how long it lasts, how intense it is, and then you get some of the identification and priming going on, and then you get a pool of at-risk potential copycats. And then you get imitation, and then finally you go into kind of first-order copycat crimes, and then you get news coverage from that. And then you get more people wanting to copy that, and you develop a secondary pool of at-risk people that might be motivated to commit the same crime. And that process repeats over and over again, where we actually are kind of emulating crimes that happened a long time ago. These phases of copycats from Surratt, the first phase, phase A, is the one for the first copycat event, and then the other is for subsequent ones that happen immediately after. So there's kind of a paradox here, and I hope you note this critique, and I hope you also feel like it's okay to critique things you read and to have differences of opinion. I know I do. I really like Surratt's work, but I also can be highly critical of it. And I invite you to be the same. So here's the paradox created in this approach to copycats. Phase A, that process is more likely for property offenders. So you get a bigger pool and you have the social contextual factors for that. But remember a couple lectures ago, we said we don't really do a lot of media coverage on property crimes unless they're completely sensational and fantastic, like burning a building down or something, arson. Media coverage is more likely for the violent crimes, which are really more likely to have multiple copycats and covered by phase B. But again, the paradox, that pool is not as large as we think it is. And really the copycat model only exists for violent offenders, which doesn't capture most criminal activity in society, because most criminal activity is property crime. So I invite you to have some healthy skepticism about copycats. Even though Surratt argues that they occur fairly regularly, we already know through research and data that they really don't. Beware of that social construction, and the overwhelming majority of crime is not copycat crime. There are a few examples here and there, but again, those are just absolutely tiny moments in crime, and it just isn't really good logic to apply this to try to explain more crime, because it really doesn't. So to what extent do we impose a construction of similarity on someone's criminal behavior and then we ignore dissimilar features? So again, it's going through our filters, it's going through our experiences and our own process of what things mean. That's all social constructionism. So for example, we talked about terrorism in the last lecture, media-oriented terrorism. So someone could say, well, is that copycat crime? Inasmuch as terrorism is defined by creating terror, grabbing media attention through dramatic action, it's almost always something terrorist acts are going to share. They're really done very differently. Hijacking planes at gunpoint for ransom is kind of an old school terrorist tactic that we really saw in the late 60s, early 70s. It got repeated in the 2000s, but maybe just a handful of times. Hijacking planes to blow up buildings or using explosives in your shoes, or the underwear bomber, versus hijacking with box cutters to use on a plane, or try to time an explosive device to crash into buildings. I mean, there are enough differences for us to say they might be getting similar ideas and making similar plans, but they're not true copycats. They're just trying to figure out what works and what gets media attention and what doesn't. But you could argue maybe that they are. And I think it's an interesting argument to have. So as far as terrorism goes, there might be a case to be made, but other criminals, not so much. Generally, and these are Surratt's conclusions, the effect of media on copycats is that it's thought to be more qualitative, affecting criminal behavior, than really quantitative, affecting the number of criminals doing it. So whether copycat crime affects influence in any particular individual really depends on the interaction of the content of a particular media product, its characterizations of crime and criminals as appealing, or how it taps into that person's dispositions toward crime, whether they have a personal criminal history, family and environmental factors, and then also the media's social context, pre-existing cultural norms about what's acceptable, what's criminal, having criminal opportunities, and then just the nature of mass media disseminating that information out. So I think this still is very important to study, and we need to recognize when it happens. But again, when it does happen, it's incredibly rare. So I hope you've enjoyed this segment on copycats and some of the ideas and models that we have about it, and I'll see you next time.